Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Pink 'Un, where it's been a busy week or so since Liam Manning was sacked as Norwich City head coach. Of course, the search is well underway for his replacement. In fact, it's probably getting towards its latter stages now. So we thought we'd come live to update you on all things Norwich City and their new manager. Of course, a few names in the frame: Will Steele, Gary O'Neill. Jon Dahl Tomasson, of course, has been sort of mainly the talk of the last few days, but also kind of a couple of other names in the frame. Not that are public yet, but certainly plenty to discuss. I'm Samuel Seaman, delighted to be joined by my colleague Connor Southwell to update us all on everything Norwich City and what's going on at the moment. I mentioned a few of those names, so we will get into those in short order. But first of all, Connor, how are you, and how's the week been since Liam Manning's been sacked as head coach?
Busy, I think that's fair to say. But yeah, I'm good. Apart from getting absolutely drenched at about 6 o'clock this morning when I was taking my dog out, which wasn't a particularly enjoyable experience. But I digress. That's not why people are here. They don't want to hear about my dog walking tales. Yeah, it's been good. It's been. I think I said this to someone earlier. It's been relentless as it has been for over the last few weeks, but I think it's nice to do it with a view to something fresh and something new, as opposed to us just being in that relentless cycle of defeats and negativity and poor results. All understandable, and I'm not saying it wasn't merited either, by the way. I think it's just nice to have a slightly different change of pace and hopefully something on the horizon that offers a little bit of hope that maybe there's something better on the horizon for this football club, which is all we desperately want. How are you, Sam?
Yeah, not bad. I feel like I've the head coach search has been kind of refreshingly quick. So thankfully, it hasn't been like in the summer, because they had so much time to do Manning. It was kind of drawn out over a long period, and there was a lot of speculation. Whereas we've had plenty of information to kind of dig into over the last week or so, and that's probably a good starting point for kind of what we're going to talk about today. I mentioned a few of those names in the frame, so I thought we'd start with Will Steele, because you wrote a piece that went out this morning about kind of him and maybe whether he would fit the role, whether he wouldn't. And I think judging from that response and kind of whether Norwich fans agreed that he was the right one, that you might have some good news to share on that one for those people who maybe were slightly sceptical. So give us the latest on Will Steele and whether he'll be Norwich City's next head coach.
Yeah, I timed it well, didn't I? I made sure I got it out before this ramped up significantly. Yeah, I mean, I think it's already been out there in other places, but yeah, our understanding is Will Steele definitely someone that Norwich City spoke to, as I think we reported earlier in the week. But our understanding is now it's looking very unlikely that he will be Norwich City's next head coach. As this kind of, as you said earlier, this process accelerates and evolves. I think that's probably, to me, feels like the right decision. I think we spoke a lot on the spaces that we did in midweek, and also on the show last week after Liam Manning's departure, that it probably felt like it needed someone to come in and galvanize it, and someone with like a really big personality to come and embrace it and try and connect with supporters. And I really like Will Steele. I think he's an excellent coach. I think it's always a little bit funny how someone can have 14 games somewhere and their reputation and how they're perceived gets completely flipped. Sometimes that's the best time to invest in a coach. I used the example of Nathan Jones as one where, you know, he was an absolute clown after his spell at Southampton, and he came back to Charlton and clearly did a very, very good and is doing a very, very good job there. So I'm always kind of loath to suggest that people aren't very good or that their stint. I think there was a lot of mitigation around that Southampton stint, but I think irrespective of that, his personality, where Norwich City find themselves, I felt contextually it probably wasn't the right time for him to walk in, as I kind of wrote about in my piece today, even though I think there's some really good evidence in terms of some of the interim jobs that he's done previously that he is able to come in and make an instant impact. Just didn't quite feel like the fit. And I think Kieran's point there that it would have felt like Dean Smith 2.0 is completely valid as well. So, that's our understanding. He was spoken to. He was one of the options they sounded out. They've had a lot of face-to-face talks with candidates this week, but it doesn't sound like that's going to progress any further at this stage. So, yeah, another swing and another miss for Will Steele and Norwich City after he was involved in the cycle a couple of years ago before Johannes Oftorot when he was toured around Colney. So clearly someone they like, but I think it's probably the right decision now not to be progressing with him.
Yeah, I think that element of the fact that he was obviously in that head coach search before is kind of an interesting one, because obviously he would have been quite keen to get that job back in summer of 2024. It's really not that long ago that Norwich were 2 head coach cycles back. but so that was kind of an interesting element, the fact that Knapper, in a sense, rejected him the last time, and then they were having the conversations about this happening again. Of course, Gary O'Neill probably in a similar position in terms of he was obviously in the running when Liam Manning got the job, didn't quite work out for the club, and he's certainly been a name that's been talked about. We've said for the last few days, and I think his name was probably the first one that came out. So we've been saying for a while that that he's kind of on that short list and at the forefront for Norwich City. But unlike Still, it sounds like right now he's probably still in the frame. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think he's still very much in this conversation and in the running, if we want to use it like that. I think basically our understanding is there's probably a, however big, I don't think we can put a number on it, but there's definitely the two that have been mentioned in terms of Gary O'Neill and Jon Dahl Tomasson definitely still in contention for this job. And then, as you kind of teased earlier, I think there's a couple of names that are as of yet to be made public that are in this race that I think are maybe they're going to be the ones that intrigue people a lot more. We don't know, and it's worth adding, we don't know if that's kind of their overseas candidates that haven't come out. We don't know if they're domestic, if they're out of work, if they're in work, but we definitely know there are a couple of options that are still very, very much contenders for this job that are not yet out there. So that probably shows where the process is. I know people have been getting very excited by odds, and people do that in managerial searches and them kind of getting cut quite low. And I know Tomasson he was about 1 to 4 on, I think, when we pressed record. So look, he's clearly in the frame. He's clearly someone they like. He clearly someone that is still very much in this process. Sounds like we're talking about The Apprentice when we go all process and speaking about that. But yeah, I wouldn't totally discount that what maybe comes out in the days, weeks ahead, be it through us or somebody else, is someone who isn't even being spoken about yet. And to be fair, that was the case with Liam Manning in the summer, wasn't it? We had the initial wave of speculation that spoke about Gary O'Neill and Pep Lijnders, and then Liam Manning came a little bit later in that process when his name emerged, and obviously eventually got the job. So Gary O'Neill definitely still in that conversation. I think they clearly spoke in the summer. I think both parties probably agreed to stay in touch with this in mind, and I think given his pedigree would be a very capable choice. I still have doubts over him in terms of I'm not quite sure what he is yet in terms of a coach. I think we've seen, and that's not his fault. It's just the jobs he's been in have been kind of firefighting ones where he's had to be pragmatic and had to probably set his team up to negate opposition strengths as opposed to maybe his ideals and what he'd like to see. And he spoke about that a little bit in his Monday Night Football appearance, where there is sometimes you have to soak it up. So in terms of where Norwich are right now, he clearly has experience of navigating teams out of danger. My question would be: is he the builder? Does he do the next bit well enough? And I think we probably don't have enough evidence of that as of yet. But I think certainly ticks the personality box, the communication box that maybe they feel they would like. And I think he's a very valid option at this stage. And the fact he's got deep again, probably into this process, even if he doesn't get it, is probably a testament of how well he's come across in probably both of these managerial cycles. So I'm sure he's probably got other championship options as well that maybe he's weighing up. So I'm sure that's probably a factor. But at the moment, I certainly wouldn't put a line through his name at this stage.
Yeah, I find O'Neill a really interesting one because I was kind of, to be honest, relatively anti. I'm still not sure he would be my first choice, but today I've written a profile that'll be going out a little bit later on Gary O'Neill and kind of whether he would be the right choice. And I think when you look at his career so far, I think probably the main evidence going against him, not in terms of the style or anything like that, but in terms of results, is the fact that obviously Wolves went on to, I know they're now obviously clearly they're struggling, but they went on to do much better after he left them last season. Bournemouth have obviously kicked on and are now competing for Europe after he finished 15th with them in his only full season, or his only season in charge of them. But I think you look at the way that he speaks, obviously a few, as you kind of referenced, a few appearances on Monday Night Football where his analysis is really encouraging, because I think in some ways he reminds me a bit of Liam Manning in terms of the flexibility, the kind of the profile, age, things like that. But he's much more willing to go into tactics and analytics and to kind of explain his strategy in that sense. And I think the communications for him, he certainly comes across to me as more of a an open book, which I think is what Norwich fans want slightly more than the slightly closed off communication style that we had from Liam Manning at times. So there are some similarities that I think would concern me. The style of play, again, I think Norwich fans generally have liked someone who has a clearly defined style of play and a philosophy that they can kind of latch onto and be sure that they're going to see every time they turn up at Carrow Road. And the comments are coming in so fast that I can't show them, but we've had a few comments kind of suggesting that the style of play is important after this Liam Manning disaster, really, and somebody who has a bit more of that identity. So I kind of find O'Neill quite an interesting proposition, but I wanted to get your take on that in terms of the balance between, I mean, someone described Will Steele as Dean Smith 2.0. I'm not sure Gary O'Neill is quite that level, but there are probably similarities with Smith, Wagner, Manning in that sense. So how do you see that balance and kind of whether he would fit the kind of Norwich tracksuit or not?
Yeah, again, I think this is my big point around O'Neill. I just don't know is the truth. I think in the here and now, I think he would come in and provide probably that injection of personality and pragmatism, maybe, that they need to get results, because ultimately where they are at this moment in time, we can talk about styles of play, but they need to get results and they need to get them pretty quickly. So in the short term, that is the job. Do I think he could do that? Absolutely, I do. I think he's kind of shown throughout his career that he's capable of setting a team up to stop opponents, to get results, to be quite pragmatic, to pick up points, to move them out of danger. But then, of course, it's the next bit, and that is the bit that I'm really unsure about, to paraphrase and use one of the former Norwich's mannerisms. That's the element that I'm probably questioning the most. I just don't know if he has that skill set, and I say that not as a I don't know if he does. I just genuinely don't know. I haven't seen it. We haven't seen it in his coaching career, and he got dropped in at Premier League level and had to problem solve. So can he build a team? That would be the big question mark around Gary O'Neill that he would have to prove. And it's one thing appearing on Sky Sports and kind of painting out your philosophy and your ideology and saying this is the way I want to play, but it's actually about implementing it in practice. And my fear is if you kind of get stuck in this cycle of short-termism where you're just constantly chasing results, you can neglect that a little bit because something's working and you stick with it rather than actually pivoting and building. I think that's the player development piece as well. We don't really know at this stage if he can do that. And again, the argument that maybe goes against Gary O'Neill is as good a job he did in very difficult circumstances at Wolves and at Bournemouth. Both of the coaches that succeeded him went on to take both of those squads into significantly better places. Now, I've no doubt Andoni Iraola, I think, is one of the best coaches in the Premier League at this moment in time. So I don't think that's necessarily a shock. Vitor Pereira, I think, is very capable and experienced as well. So I don't think it's a major red flag, but it's a point of reference that is worth making. So, look, I think the long term, it is going to be about ultimately building something that's a bit more sustainable. Can he do that? That's going to be the question that I think he's going to have to face and put his kind of case point in these touch points, in these conversations, these interviews, these meetings that he's having in regards to this job. Because I agree. I think there is the foundations there of a very talented young coach, and I think you can also overcorrect a lot, and just because Norwich decided in the summer that maybe it wasn't him and maybe Liam Manning was better suited, you have to tweak and change a little bit. The fact he's been involved in both of these processes, as I said, is clearly a suggestion that he is close to what they would like. But I just don't know. I feel like he's still quite a risk, even though he's got that Premier League pedigree behind him and those games, in terms of where Norwich City want to get. I've no doubt he could do this job at the moment. But my fear is in 6 months' time, when it becomes a slightly different job, providing obviously Norwich can get themselves out of the mire, is he then able to do that bit? And I'm not quite sure we know at this stage. And that's, is that a bigger risk than someone overseas or someone that's unknown? I'm not really sure it is. So that is probably the big question mark for me around Gary O'Neill. But I think he's a coach I like, and you can't completely discount what he did at Wolves and Bournemouth, which were excellent in isolation, particularly in those first seasons.
Yeah, definitely. I think I agree with almost everything you said there, particularly the fact that we kind of don't know what he would be, which for an English head coach who's been playing in the EFL and the Premier League for the whole of his career, has managed in the Premier League with 2 different clubs over 2.5 seasons. It's quite a bizarre thing to be saying, but I do genuinely one that I think he could be completely in the Dean Smith camp, once if he does put on the Norwich tracksuit and hold up the yellow and green scarf, or he could, go and turn into someone like a Paul Lambert who has that, that personality, but also some of the tactical knowledge that probably you need in today's game. So I'm kind of undecided on O'Neill, and I think Ben Knapper is probably the person who right now has the best idea of what he would want to do with this Norwich side. So it'll be interesting to see how things pan out with him. Of course, the other main name in the frame is Jon Dahl Tomasson. There have been a few other suggestions that people have been putting in the comments and having a debate over, and I promise we will come to those. But to start off with, or to go to Tomasson next, it feels like there's been quite a lot of optimism about him, certainly since his name came into the frame on Wednesday, I think it was. Obviously did what I think was a really, really good job against Blackburn in circumstances that I think maybe people don't appreciate were as difficult as they were, really, really difficult. You saw the way that John Eustace left the club, the way that obviously Tomasson left the club. Eventually, the squad of players that he had, I thought he got a lot out of that squad of players. And also the playing style to manage that with a squad that was probably built at little expense, with a probably championship experience as one of the main characteristics, to have them playing not, Hoff ball or fart ball, but a more proactive style than I think there's been at a lot of those types of championship clubs. I thought he did really well there, but he's not really got that momentum right now. He's just had, by all accounts, a very poor spell in charge of Sweden. I understand that's obviously completely different to kind of club football, and maybe we shouldn't judge his quality as a championship head coach based on that that spell in charge of Sweden. But the thing that worries me is the momentum, and you kind of want someone who's on the way up. And as much as O'Neill obviously has been sacked from his last two jobs, it feels still like he's got quite a lot of credit in the bank. He's broadly succeeded in both of his jobs. Will Still was probably someone who, as well, you said that the stock had kind of dropped, but largely I think still would have been seen as a bit of a coup for Norwich. So for me, the momentum element and maybe the confidence element that Tomasson would bring would be the concern, but otherwise a lot to feel good about. So as far as you understand it, what's the latest with him, and how do you feel about the prospect of Tomasson taking over at Norwich?
Yeah, similar to O'Neill, still very much in the race. One of the ones that we know are still in the process, as I said, along with a couple of others that are yet to be named. So this idea that, in the betting he's running away with things, I think is maybe a little bit misguided at this stage. That's not to say he's not a preferred candidate, but I just don't think we're at that stage where that is happening. And I think we'll probably go into later maybe where we're at and the timeline on things. But look, I think with all of these candidates, where Norwich are at the moment, there's going to be a degree of imperfection about them naturally, and because they're looking seemingly out of work managers at this moment in time, unless one of the others that emerges. And again, we generally don't know who those people are. It could be anyone in world football, but all of the names that we're speaking here haven't got a job. So I think it's fair to assume that that's the direction that Norwich are going down, and that obviously allows them to move fairly quickly. He does tick boxes, doesn't he, in terms of the player development? Clearly, you can see the Adam Wharton is the example that is Scott Wharton's brother, and slightly lesser known. Adam Wharton, who's the more well-known one, he was someone that Jon Dahl Tomasson plucked out of the youth team at Blackburn and really developed and improved. Tyrese Dolan, equally. We could list up. Sammy Schmodek's had a really successful time under him, and I think what he does have is that player development piece of improving players and pushing them forwards, and maybe not just young players either. I think, having spoken and looked into his spell at Blackburn, there was also players that he improved that were a little bit more experienced, and he did that within a real structure that was attractive to watch, but quite ideological. And the sense I get from him is that he is a big character, that actually there's very little regard of if fans like him, if players like him. He's going to come in, do it his way. And if you don't do it or you don't like it, then it's kind of his way or the highway. And I think to an extent, when Norwich are at the lack of confidence, that can be quite positive to have that structure, because if you get the ball in a certain position, you've got to move it here, and it can be that. It can also be quite limiting as well. So I think it depends on the group of players that you have. But I always think this notion that You know, when you're down there, you just need to get out by playing a 4-4-2 and having backs to the wall and defending really deep. I'm just not sure that's right, actually. And of course, Norwich need to improve defensively. I'm not saying that. But if you look at the players that Norwich have at the top end of the pitch, I think anyone that comes in should be excited by the prospect of what their attacking prowess could do if they could link the team, if they could add balance to the team. And that's something that I think Jon Dahl Tomasson could do. Are there drawbacks? Absolutely. I think he would be a huge risk at this stage. I think there'd be major question marks about whether he could come in and make that instant impact in terms of being able to build a style of play without a pre-season and without having that time. I mean, whoever the next head coach is essentially... it depends how early they get in, but they're going to get some training time before Birmingham, hopefully, all being well. And then you go straight into a 3-game week. So is he going to be able to come in and just drop a whole new system and way of playing on this team? I don't know. That's going to be really fascinating to see if it is him. So I really like him. I like the personality he is. I think the way he conducts himself with the media, from stuff that I've seen in research and whatnot, is impressive. I think the style of play has a really high ceiling. And he develops players, which ultimately is what Norwich want at this moment in time. And ultimately, let's be honest, what they need, because developing players means improving their performances. And all of those Norwich City players, to a man, need to improve their performances for Norwich City to get out of where they are. So I think he's probably the one I look at this stage of the names we know about. And he feels probably like the one that ticks the most boxes, without obviously knowing the guys who maybe are still in this race that are yet to be named and yet to be public. So I can understand why people are feeling excited about him. I don't think you can overlook the fact that Norwich have a Danish core of players as well that he would connect and understand with. That may be able to help in terms of the impact that he could have straight away. And you look at that first season at Blackburn, there was a slight overperformance in terms of their data. And I think it's worth saying as well, they jumped up to 7th on the final day because they beat Millwall. And I think Millwall could have got in the playoffs and Blackburn never really could. But it was one of those situations where they beat them. I think George Long was in goal for Millwall that day. So you make your own jokes about that. So I think there maybe is a little, as always, there's always a little bit of context you have to look into this. Worth adding, he wasn't sacked by Blackburn. He resigned. Like you say, I don't think you can totally dismiss that Sweden reign as well, which, given the talent they had, maybe didn't quite go the way that anyone would have wanted. But again, difficult to look in context until we see how Graham Potter does with Sweden, I think, and the same squad. So yeah, I like him. I'm probably not as hot on him as Paddy is. I think Paddy, as he said in Spaces, is his number one choice, which is cool. I'll be honest, I don't think any of the list so far has really grabbed me. But then, you know, I was pretty grabbed by Liam Manning in the summer, so maybe I've just kind of numbed myself with it a little bit. But I don't mind this shout. And as I said, I think it's probably the one that ticks the most boxes at this moment in time, which is why I think it's probably created the reaction that it has.
Yeah, I think I agree completely, really. Nobody really jumping out to me as an especially exciting option for Norwich, but maybe that's where, you know, everyone needs to be realistic about where they are and the fact that they're 23rd in the Championship. It's not necessarily the same job that Liam Manning took or Johannes Torup took before him. So, I think, as you say, there's always going to be some element of weakness with whoever they go with. And I think, for me, of the names public, and of course, there's always room for improvement with these other candidates that we don't know about yet. I think he's the one that probably would make sense to me most. As you said, we will get into the timeline in a little while, but before then, I'm going to ask you about a couple of the names that have come up that maybe haven't been kind of discussed forefront. We've had George asking about Michael Carrick. Anything linking Carrick, boys? Have you heard anything? And would that make a lot of sense? I'm going to pair him with someone who seems to be producing even more discussion in the comments, as you can imagine. That is Russell Martin. Finley says, not my pick, but why does Martin seem to be dismissed by Knapper? Which I think is probably a fair point, because you kind of look... you look at some of the other names involved and the kind of typical managerial merry-go-round. Martin wasn't spoken to in the summer, even if he was perhaps interested in the job when Liam Manning was hired. Again, this time around, of course, he's available after being sacked by Rangers. And it's a similar situation, isn't it, really, with Russell Martin and also with Michael Carrick, who it seems neither of whom are in the race to be the next Norwich City head coach at this moment in time.
Yeah, I think speaking about sort of putting lines through names, I think you could probably put a line through both of those, but definitely Russ. I think that there probably was a bit more contact this time than perhaps there was in the summer, but I think that was mostly at agent level rather than kind of those face-to-face talks that happened with a host of candidates in London this week. I don't believe I've heard nothing to suggest Russell Martin was one of those that they sat down with, and like you say, I think the opportunity was probably, if they wanted to go down that direction, was there in the summer, wasn't it? In terms of he would have been open and receptive to a conversation. I think he would have been again. But again, it's context, isn't it? He's super ideological. He is someone who has a very clear style of play. I think, unlike maybe Gary O'Neill, you do know what he would come in and try and do, whether you like it or don't like it. And I respect it's totally subjective and divisive to a lot of people, as is him as a personality as well, to be honest. So. Yeah. If you want to go for a unifying figure, it maybe isn't the right time for Russ at the moment. I think is probably fair to say. I think clearly, look, Ben Knapper would be able to answer that question as to why he doesn't feel he's the right fit. But that's two cycles now where, contrast it with O'Neill, he hasn't been front and center of a search. So I think that probably is fairly conclusive in terms of where Ben Knapper's head is at in terms of Russell Martin. As for Michael Carrick, probably less conclusive in terms of like. I can't definitively rule him out, but I've not heard his name mentioned at absolutely any stage of this cycle at all post Liam Manning. I think he's got a job as a UEFA technical observer, and he's doing some stuff. He was on Match of the Day recently and didn't really suggest he was getting itchy feet and wanted to dive straight back in. So I'm sure he's probably just taking his time, because the reality is then, as for O'Neill, to be fair, the next job for him is absolutely massive after Middlesbrough, where I think over the piece would look at it and he did a very, very good job. But then equally, he's somebody who didn't get Middlesbrough promoted, and I think got them in the playoffs once or twice. So and irrespective of how well his successor has done, he's ultimately left them in the top two. So just didn't quite get the job done. So I think he's got to be careful about the job that he picks next. And I'm sure there's probably a timing point to it as well. Sometimes the longer you stay out of a game, the more attractive you can become to potential clubs. And he's still out of the game relatively recently. So I've heard nothing at all to suggest that he's in the race to become Norwich City's head coach. So it's been all quiet around him, to be completely honest.
Yeah, definitely. And as you say, I think those comments on Match of the Day suggested he wasn't desperate to get back in. And again, I think he's one, given how highly rated he is by a lot of people, where you have to maybe consider the position that Norwich are in as well. And the fact that he was consistently in and around the playoffs, and then ultimately, obviously, left the club, but Norwich are 23rd currently. And there's the prospect that whoever takes them over could be managing in League One next season. So, I think probably you have to bear that in mind with him as well. There's somebody else who's come up in the comments who maybe I wasn't expecting, and I haven't heard his name yet. And I'll be surprised if you have, but you can tell me otherwise. So I'm just interested to get your opinion, and that is Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. We've had Zeb Sam saying any chance of Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. Matt Johnson has suggested maybe him as well. He might have been reached out to after saying he'd be open to taking over a championship club. So I haven't heard anything. I don't know if you've heard anything, Connor, but what do you kind of make of him as potentially a rogue shout for one of those head coaches who isn't currently in the frame or hasn't been made public yet?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of 2 + 2 = 5 here after his appearance on the Overlap in the week saying that. I mean, he did kind of caveat it with mid to top level championship club, which Norwich aren't currently. No. But of course, I know reputationally where they are. Look, so my view is, and again, like you, I haven't heard anything to suggest he is or isn't in the frame. Just heard nothing at all about him concretely at all. My feeling is, if Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was in the running for a managerial job in the Championship, that would have got out somewhere if he'd have been spoken to or sounded out. So that is my kind of initial view. I mean, he left Besiktas quite recently. He was Manchester United manager. He's a big name in football. I think in the same Overlap interview, he said that his agent had some contact with Rangers as well. So he's courting jobs that maybe are slightly above where Norwich City find themselves at the moment. So I'd be surprised if suddenly we got to Sunday and it was like, oh my goodness, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer is going to be. No, it's not impossible. I haven't heard that's definitely not going to be the case, but it would be a surprise for me if that was the case at this stage. but he's an interesting coach, isn't he? I think we probably look back at his Manchester United spell more fondly now than we did at the time because of what's followed him. Sort of quite a vibrant style of play, quite quick, quite transitional. He had a lot of pacey players in that team. And then Besiktas, well, Turkey's a very difficult market, I think, to judge any coach because of how ruthless it is. But I think already had a 52% win percentage, which isn't too bad in that context. Although Besiktas always want to be trying to win the league over there. If you don't do that, you're going to be in trouble. So an intriguing name. I definitely get the suggestions and the shouts. Similarly to Carrick, I've heard absolutely nothing to suggest he is or isn't in the running at this stage. But I would have thought personally, if Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was in the running, that someone somewhere in the media would have heard about that and put it out, given his Manchester United connections and relationships he has up there.
Yeah, I think I agree. I would be surprised, but certainly an interesting name. And probably the timing of that has kind of helped the speculation that maybe he could be in the frame. But yeah, I feel probably similar in that sense. I said we'd get onto the time frame. It feels like now Birmingham is becoming a factor. Obviously, it's been clear throughout the process that they've wanted someone in that away dugout at St Andrews taking charge of the team, and people are already thinking about how much time they've got to set the team up. Of course, right now Ryan Gary in charge with a little bit of experience in this kind of role, and we've got a profile on him as well on the Pinken app if people want to go and read that. But they do want somebody to come in and have a bit of time probably to impart their ideas onto the players ahead of this Birmingham game. But right now, as we've kind of talked about, there are still a few names in the frame. It's not the case where somebody sat in Ben Knapper's office negotiating over a contract and that's gonna happen. So how quickly would you expect things to kind of unfold from here? Because it feels like, although things are certainly further along in the process than they were a few days ago, there probably is still a little bit of work to do.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think we're definitely getting towards the back end of this process now. Is what I would say. I think there's still probably another step to go. Clearly, they've done the face-to-face discussions. I'm sure they will have probably held another round of conversations and basically the way it tends to work. And I'm not necessarily saying this is what Norwich have done, but you hear kind of in the game stories that you have different rounds and then it's not an elimination. I don't want to make it game show like, but you filter it, don't you, as you go through of those names. And clearly that has happened to an extent for a position where Will Still was spoken to earlier in the week and now isn't really in the running anymore. So that would suggest that process is moving. I think there's still an extra stage where I am sure options will be presented to Norwich City's board at some stage, whether that is 2 or 3. And I'm sure probably with that, sporting director Ben Knapper, and I think that there are others at Norwich as well. I know it was kind of Knapper and Neil Adams. I think there are others at Norwich and also in the data company they use who have been involved in some of these conversations that they've been having with potential candidates. Well, the next stage is that those kind of final ones, if we wanted to use that term and make it all X factory, which could be 2 or 3. I think we'll basically sit down and speak then to the owner, Mark Attanasio, and the board. Now that clearly, because he's based in America, would happen remotely, you would assume, unless he wants to fly them all out to LA or Milwaukee or wherever he happens to be residing at the moment. But I think that will happen remotely. I'm sure along with that, Ben Knapper will make the case for perhaps one of those candidates more than the others. But I get the sense definitely that Mark's going to put his eyes and speak to directly a couple of candidates, and then from there I think we'll obviously get to a stage where the process moves and we start talking about people being offered jobs and whatnot. So look, they want to get someone in before Birmingham. I think that's very likely, as opposed to can we absolutely definitively nail it down and say it's going to be at this day at this time? No, not at this stage, because I think it's still pretty fluid. But I think that the feeling is it could accelerate pretty quickly over this weekend, because ultimately that you've got a full training week into Birmingham, and if you've got a new head coach in charge, you want to give them the best opportunity to win that game. And how do you give them the best opportunity? By giving them lots of sessions and giving them enough sessions to try and push all of that together before that game against Birmingham. So yeah, I think the hope is that it will accelerate quite fast, but as ever with these things, it's always difficult in practice to know when and where that's going to be. So that kind of feels like where we're at with things. I think, as we said throughout, there's still a few names in the frame, but one of them isn't still. And we're at a stage now probably where they're going to continue getting filtering out probably in the hours and days ahead before we get to a stage where someone is holding a scarf or being unveiled as Norwich City's next head coach. But I don't get the sense we're a million miles away at this stage.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you mentioned there Ben Knapper quite a lot, and obviously the fact that he's been conducting the interviews, he will have been sounding out the options in the first place and deciding which of those head coaches he wants to speak to. We've had a lot of comments about Ben Knapper on today's video. People will have seen. I've seen a lot on social media, kind of making this point as well. Shaney says we need to seriously talk about whether we can trust Ben Knapper. He sacked David Wagner, Johannes Torup, and now Liam Manning. He hasn't even spoken out yet in regards to Liam Manning. That's before we announced the new head coach. There's also been a petition going around that I think a lot of people would have seen. I think it's got well over 1,000 signatures now from Norwich fans trying to get rid of Knapper. As well, we've got Robert Marsh saying Knapper should have nothing to do with the process, otherwise we'll get failure number 3 on his watch. So we can probably get into whether he'll come out and speak and in what kind of way going forward. But to start off with, I wanted to get your take on just kind of Knapper's situation, the fact that he's in post right now. I think there are still a lot of people saying, he shouldn't be involved in this appointment of the next head coach. I think that's, to be honest, at this point, by the by. He's obviously been interviewing the candidates. He's going to make a recommendation of, at least one, probably more candidates to Atanasio, as you outlined. So he is very much in this process. He hasn't been dismissed despite obviously a couple of coaching failures. Now you could throw Wagner in there as well, the fact that he sacked him and make it 3. So a lot of pressure on Ben Knapper. Are you surprised that he's involved in this process to appoint the next head coach?
Not hugely, if I'm being honest. I think it would have been very bold and ballsy, probably for want of another term, for Norwich to get rid of both. Now there are examples of that happening. I know Wolfsburg have done that in recent days. There was an English example as well that I can't think of at the moment, but there was it was Wolves, wasn't it? Wolves did it as well. So there are examples where you do that, but again, I think that needs to be underpinned by probably wider football knowledge on the board that are maybe capable of making decisions. I just don't really see where else that's going to come from at this stage. And I think Mark Atanasio made quite clear in his Radio Norfolk interview that he wanted time to kind of assess the executive level. So I think I agree with Matt's comment there. I was going to come on to that. I think if you're him now, there's an element probably of, what have I got to lose? Pick someone that you feel is going to do the best job, that maybe you're ideologically aligned to, and go that way about it, rather than perhaps someone who's proven, or someone who maybe has a bit of a reputation in this country. I think we're kind of seen the pitfalls of that with Liam Manning. I think now it's about maybe trying to find someone that's a bit bold and someone that can galvanise things. Because again, and I made this point a few times, we're not just talking about a new manager coming in and trying to inject some confidence into a group of players, but I think also into a football club and into a fan base that feels disconnected and really angry about the state of play. Clearly, because we're in a managerial cycle, we will hear from Ben Knapper, because he's going to be sat at the top table doing a press conference. I think my hope, and look, hopefully this will be the case. So let's see. But I think it would be helpful if Ben Knapper came out maybe after they've appointed someone and almost did a kind of separate round, because I think if the first time the cameras are on him and the microphones are in his face is at the unveiling press conference, I would feel sorry, I think, for the new head coach in that kind of situation, because it should be an opportunity for them to make their case. And let's have it right, should be optimistic as well, not just for the new head coach, but for the fan base. And I hope there's almost some distance put behind maybe what's gone before, and some responsibility taken for the mistakes and the mess that Norwich City find themselves in, and then we could have a clear break and then go into a press conference. That to me would be the best way of doing it. I think that wouldn't surprise me if that was the way it unfolded, but kind of let's see how it happens over the next few days, because you're right. If you're Ben Knapper, the only way really of changing that approval rating, of preventing those protests, and of changing people's minds, if that is possible, is going to be through this head coach being successful, winning football matches, and bringing people together. So in many ways, he's probably to an extent his future and his success and all of those things are now beholden to whoever the next head coach is, which is a remarkable position to be in for him. But that is the position. So I think it probably would be wise for him almost to put a little bit of distance between himself and the new head coach in that sense. But clearly, fans want to hear from him. I would make the point, and in fairness to Ben Knapper, like he has done media. I wouldn't say he's done any less media than Stuart Webber did. You can question the timing of it and whatnot. And look, clearly, naturally, some of that has had to happen because they've had two new managers in that stage. But he did do it in the first February, then in the summer when he appointed Torup. Then he did another round, didn't he, last February? Then another round when Norwich appointed Liam Manning. Then this is going to be another round. So we are kind of talking every 6 months, which isn't that far off what Stuart Webber did really in terms of volume, in fairness to Ben Knapper. And equally, I think some people would make the point there are a lot of sporting directors in the game who don't come out and speak ever, irrespective of where the club are at. So the fact that is a prerequisite of the situation at Norwich, I think, is a testament maybe to how much fans care, but also how invested they are in terms of the structures and the people that run their football club. That level of accountability is a good thing. It's not there at a lot of clubs. I think you could go around the country and ask a lot of clubs who their sporting director is, and some fans in those fan bases wouldn't know. That's not the case at Norwich City. And I think, in fairness, we probably have to hat tip Stuart Webber in terms of making that role prominent and giving it the sincerity that Norwich fans treat it with, and absolutely it should be treated with. So I'm hopeful that we will hear from Ben Knapper. Well, in fact, we definitely will hear from Ben Knapper in the next week. So it's going to be fascinating to see as and when he speaks, but also the structure and the format of it, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And just to address, because James asked a question on this front, have you asked to speak to him? Of course, we are. We're always asking to speak to him. We've been asking probably for the last few weeks, and as Connor kind of outlined there, I wouldn't be surprised if there is something, maybe not before the appointment, because obviously it's going to be quite a busy few days for him in terms of narrowing down these candidates and getting closer to making an appointment. But hopefully we get a chance to sit down with him to kind of not necessarily clear the air, but address all the issues that probably fans want addressed from the past before they kind of crack on with the future and new head coach and unveiling them. Just to kind of clear that one up. Kevin's asked a question about the backroom staff. When they appoint a new coach, will they bring in their own staff? There was an issue with that before and very expensive. Probably what we have to outline with that situation with James Krause and Chris Hogg was that eventually they did come in before the start of pre-season. It didn't actually have any impact on Liam Manning's reign in the end, and all the assumptions they were operating on did come true with those two. So it did drag on a little bit, but ultimately it was resolved. But to kind of open it out a little bit as well, and for what it's worth, and Connor, you might disagree with me, but I do think it's very likely that whoever comes in will bring at least one or two members of staff. Although there are obviously club appointments in Ryan Gary, Tony Roberts, and Nick Stanley in that staff at the moment. So I think there will be people coming along with them. But I also wanted to ask you about kind of the financial element of it. Obviously, whoever the new coach comes in, if it is someone out of work, which right now it looks fairly likely to be, there won't be any compensation paid. Same situation with the backroom staff, unless they want someone who they're not currently working with from another club. So it won't be costly in that sense. But the financial element of it is probably something that has to be considered with this as well, right? Because even though Mark Attanasio clearly has very deep pockets, is very open to the fact, about the fact that he's willing to splash the cash on Norwich as far as the profit and sustainability rules allow him to do so. Is that another thing that's kind of adding pressure to Knapper and maybe did need to be considered in this cycle as well? Because, he's already paid compensation for, and then, compensation to both of the head coaches that he's hired. So do you think that has been / will be a consideration?
Yeah, possibly. I find the framing around like managerial compensation really interesting, because Norwich paid £800,000 for Liam Manning in the summer, which, when you kind of talk about head coaches, that feels like a lot, but actually if you translate it, I mean, they paid £4 million for Mirko Topic, and it is no different really in terms of the transaction. So managerial and coaching compensation is by nature a lot significantly lower than kind of player recruitment. So I don't think it would be a huge issue anyway. But like you say, I mean, if we look at Jon Dahl Tomasson, he has an assistant that he brings with him. The name escapes me at the moment, but it's an experienced guy who he's had at Blackburn and at Malmo. And then more interestingly for me, kind of at Sweden and at Blackburn as well, he had a chap called Ben Rosen who was kind of his director of performance. Now that's a role that Norwich don't have. Clearly, there's a lot of attention on their fitness and their injuries, and maybe having an external view on things would be quite interesting. He's a young guy, came through at Southampton, went abroad, was at Malmo when he kind of crossed paths with Jon Dahl Tomasson, and then subsequently has been at Blackburn and at Sweden with him. And I think he had a spell at Burton where he did some of the recruitment, and there's some wild stuff in there in his background that you can go and check out on. So that would be an example for his two. I think Gary O'Neill's had Sean Derry, hasn't he? And Tim Jenkins, I think, who typically has been his assistant, who worked with him at Liverpool, at Bournemouth and at Wolves. So I'm sure he would have some idea of the backroom team. But in those two examples of the guys that we know, they are not, they're not in work, their coaches. So there wouldn't be a compensatory issue. It's just, of course, if they wanted members of staff that currently were in work, and Norwich already have kind of the club appointments there. Ryan Gary, you would expect. I'd be surprised if he didn't stay around when the new manager was unveiled. Likewise, Tony Roberts, who looks after the goalkeepers. Likewise, Nick Stanley, who obviously heads up the set piece area of it. I would expect all of those guys to stay in place. So there is the structure and the foundation there. And the reason that clubs do that now and hire people that are club appointments rather than managerial ones is to try and reduce the cost of when you change manager, having to, a manager taking 7 assistants with them, which is costly. And then you have to change all of them and whatnot. The fact that really only 2 have left with Liam Manning isn't too bad. Only 1 left with Johannes Hoff-Torp. Only 1 left with David Wagner, but he's still there in the academy and so never really left. So they haven't really had huge volumes. We're not talking about like when Daniel Farker went and it was kind of 4 members of staff with him. So I think that probably is a better way to do it. You look at Brentford, who have had good success doing that and clearly have promoted from within with Keith Andrews and have had a lot of success from a coaching perspective as well. So I think it's probably less of an issue now than it used to be. I'm sure whoever comes in will have members of staff they want to bring. That's right. That's proper. That's the way it should be. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about that. And ultimately, if they did have to pay compensation, those levels would be nowhere near what we talk about in terms of player recruitment. So I always find it interesting how these things get framed with managers, where kind of 6-figure fees get kind of, like, whoa, wow, that's a lot of money, when actually it probably isn't really in the footballing world.
Yeah, I do find it really interesting when you've got this person who's in charge of literally all of the players who have cost, some of them £7-8 million, and they cost 800,000, £1 million, and it feels like a lot. I remember, I think Graham Potter, off the top of my head, cost somewhere around 20 million when Chelsea took him from Brighton, and everyone thought that was loads. I remember thinking they've signed players for more than 100 million before, and that's one of the 25 people he's in charge of. So yeah, I think you make a good point that sometimes the compensation for managers, although it feels like a lot and it feels like an outgoing that's happening particularly often when they're hiring and firing head coaches in quick succession, the amounts of money compared to what they're paying for players and they're spending on wages is not actually that much. So maybe it does add a bit more pressure to Knapper, just in terms of the fact that Atanasio knows money is being spent on these things the whole time. But in terms of Norwich going forward and their financial viability, I don't expect it to have loads of impact. And we've had a question about this from Daniel Finnemore about PSR, which I'll just quickly address because I checked on this a little while ago. They actually made a profit, and you can probably tell from the accounts as well, to be fair. They made a profit on player trading this last summer window. So, and they already had a decent amount of headroom in that sense. So I don't think that's something that they're particularly worried about behind the scenes. Although we don't know the exact numbers, they should have a decent amount to play with. And of course, the profit they made on Marcelino Nunez means there's a pot of cash that didn't get spent in the summer. And I would expect them, if they want to go and buy players in January, which Manning suggested he wanted before he went, which Atanasio has spoken about perhaps being an avenue for going forward. I think that money will be there to be spent. We'll be live for the next sort of 5-10 minutes. So if you've got any more comments you want to squeeze in, then do that. But I just wanted to take you away from, I want to take you away from explicitly the head coach search and into something else that's happened at the club over the last few days. I had to go on your article to just double check the name of the company, because it's not exactly catchy. SRC Football. Mark Attanasio they are a data company who currently work with lots of different football clubs to help them identify players, identify coaches, analyze performance, lots of different things with data, and sort of diving deep into that. Now, Mark Attanasio is set to buy that company, SRC, and integrate them into Norwich City to almost become part of probably the large majority of that data analysis department and how they use data behind the scenes. Now, it's caused an interesting debate among Norwich fans, a lot of whom are kind of now divided between pro data and anti-data. I'm sure you'll tell me more about how it's not exactly just one or the other, and how it's about using those. But yeah, just tell us a little bit about, first of all, data, maybe how it's been involved in the managerial process, because we know that this company have been involved in identifying the next potential Norwich City head coach as well. And tell us about Attanasio buying the company and how that's going to work.
Yeah, it's a fascinating step, first and foremost. It's something that's been pretty rare in England. I think someone pointed out that Everton's ownership have done it relatively recently as well. But Arsenal maybe is the best example, which is where kind of Ben Knapper and Sarah Rudd, who co-founded this company with her husband, come into this because they were part of Stats DNA, who were bought by Arsenal and then kind of became their in-house stats company rather than being available to everyone else, which is maybe where Norwich City are trying to head with this. So yeah, they're guys who have been embedded in the football club now for a long time. I remember Ben Knapper saying to us probably it predated his time at the club, but definitely since he arrived, they've been used kind of as external consultants and advisors on this thing. And I think when we think about data, ultimately we talk about performance. I think it's a little bit more than that, and in fact it is more than that. Like you say, it comes into coach identification in terms of first team analysis, some academy stuff as well. So it isn't purely just the identification and signing of players. There are different ways in the football strategy that you can utilize data. And then I think it probably comes on to the second point, which you discussed, which is when you kind of mention data and stats and all those type of things, I think it becomes quite binary in terms of either, players are getting signed completely on stats or they're getting signed completely on the eye test. And in reality, that data probably works as kind of your initial, if you think about it, as a big fishing net. It catches those players that maybe would ordinarily slip through when you're just going out and watching players, because they allow you to filter what is a huge database across the world of players. Think about all the players that play professional football globally. We're talking about hundreds of thousands probably, and they allow you to filter it and filter and filter and keep filtering until you get maybe a select group of players that you would like. That is where, in my mind, then the process should become a little bit more about the eye test and about going out and watching players. And Norwich do that. They still go out and watch players and, identify players that way as well. You don't really do one without the other. You don't tend to, or I certainly hope it wouldn't be the case that you sign a player purely through what they look like on a spreadsheet and their numbers and the graphs and all of that stuff. It has to be then married up. That should just be your route into them. Someone is really interested. So we can maybe use the Emi Buendia example as the best example of this, because I think it's the one that maybe was the most successful, where and I know Stuart Webber's spoken about this subsequently. They were looking for a player that created a high volume of opportunities, and the use of data allowed them to find Emi Buendia. If they didn't have that, they wouldn't have been able to, because it allowed them to filter and to cut and to look into divisions and reach into divisions that maybe other clubs weren't looking in, or maybe that they could interpret data that would allow them to find someone who was a little bit undervalued or was underperforming. And that was the case with Emi Buendia, who, when they looked at his numbers, had a high volume of chance creativity and quality. But then, as Stuart Webber explained, it's then about the next bit. So you've identified that player. There's something really interesting about them, but then you have to go and watch them, and you have to see the type of chances they create, where the areas that they get on the pitch, how they perform when they're playing badly, for example. All of those sort of intangible elements happen in that phase, and it was, and as Stuart Webber said, what they found was that he was a player who wanted to slot the ball in behind quite consistently. And so then it's not just about that player, it's about then identifying a striker that's capable to do that and to get onto the end of those balls. Otherwise, there's no good signing one player. So you have to use it in context, and you have to put it together in terms of a jigsaw. in terms of a jigsaw, and that's where you get the best use of it. So I think it's a little bit more blended than what people think. And actually, those people maybe go, "Oh, well, you've got to go out and watch players." Well, that is happening as well. They are watching players with eyes. They do have scouts that travel around the world and watch players. They've got scouts on the ground in South America, for example. They've got scouts who are here, there, and everywhere every weekend watching players, not just on video but in the flesh, and watching them numerous times as well. So this notion that they're just signing players because they look good on graphs, I think is just not true, really. Of course, you can then question the processes about whether they watched them enough and all of that stuff, and that is totally fair. But I think you have to have that understanding of how it's utilized, and if utilized correctly, it can be very beneficial. I feel they've probably gone more and maybe gone too far in terms of potential, and maybe signing players individualistically in terms of they look very good data wise, maybe have looked good in isolation when they've gone to watch them. But for me, the issue is more how they've then blended that squad together. I don't think they've put the pieces of the jigsaw together well enough in terms of, we've got X player in this position, that means we need Y in front of them. That's probably the bit I have an issue with, rather than some of the players that they've identified, who I think individually we would look at as being talented. I think Mateus Christgoren has shown that he's talented. Pelle Matson, I think we've seen enough. There are elements of his game that are very pleasing. There are huge bits that he needs to work on as well. Papa Amadou Diallo, I think there are elements there that are really exciting, and there are elements there that they need to refine and harness. So I don't think this is as binary as people made it out to be. You've got to have a balance. You've got to add context and overlay it, and it's a very complex process. But as I said, it's not just purely data in terms of recruitment. It gets used in lots of things. Medically, it gets used to sort of examine players and the sports science aspects as well, which again, I know people are going to shout, well, they haven't done very well at that either. But I would say that they could not be using data, and they could be doing just as poorly in the areas that we talk about. I don't think it is on data why they're not doing it. I think it's probably the way it's being interpreted and used and putting it in a wider context. So hopefully that explains it and wasn't just a big preamble. But I think it's a good step. I think it's an innovative step, and I think it's something that will help them in the future, if I'm being honest, doing this. And Norwich can be doing badly, and I think we can applaud some good stuff. And I think this probably is a good move, and it's a good idea, because my big complaint has always been, well, if you want to be data driven and you want to make decisions based on data, then you've got to make sure the data you're using is unique and is individual to you. Because, well, if 15 other championship clubs are using the same data set, how are you going to get any edge? It's very, very hard to do that.
They're just signing the same players.
Exactly. So I think it's a good step that they're doing this.
Yeah, I think you've explained it very well there. And for me, it is one of those things where it's just it's a tool, and ultimately it comes down to who's using it and how effective they are at using it. There are still decisions to be made. Ben Knapper still has to look at a list of probably 15 players, maybe more, with great data, and decide which one suits Norwich the best, and then decide which one you send scouts to, which ones you spend more money scouting and things like that. So it's still, the overwhelming majority of recruitment is about decision making at the top level, and ultimately I think that's probably where things have gone wrong over the last couple of years in terms of recruitment. And we've actually had another question that I think gives a perfect example. How did Nunez and Sarah get spotted? Was that pure data or actual bodies on the ground? And the answer, as kind of you explained there, is both. And actually that probably, although I'm not sure I'm going to get many fans for saying that Nunez was a good example of recruitment, but that's probably a good example of where data works quite well, because before you had it, I'm not sure there were too many times Norwich were picking up midfielders who ran particularly far, playing for Universidad Católica in Chile. I think that they would have struggled with that before, whereas now they can find the data, they can see that he runs further than anyone else in South America and Europe, and then they've got scouts, as you referenced, out in South America who can go and watch him play and can assess him, and then they can decide to sign him based on that. So actually, I think those two players are probably the perfect example of where working with data and other things, came together perfectly. And unfortunately, they haven't had too many examples of that since then. But it could all be looking up very soon, because obviously, as we've discussed throughout today, Norwich will have a head coach relatively soon. It looks like being quite a busy few days. So keep it locked to our channels, pinken.com/subscribe, the place to go if you haven't already, and you'll have access to all the latest on Norwich City's head coach search. And then once that happens, of course, we'll be speaking to all of the key people, analysing everything and looking into it ahead of Birmingham, which feels like a big game and an exciting one, especially, with the games now picking up going into Christmas. It'll be a very exciting period for Norwich City's new head coach, whoever that is. Thanks very much, Connor, for your insights. Thanks, everyone, for watching. And as I said, more of this at pinkun.com/subscribe. See you for the next one.